In the late 70s, my uncle was studying medicine at the University of Chicago. After a morning class, he decided that he would hitchhike back home to the Lincoln Park on the north side instead of paying for a taxi. A man drove up in a Plymouth Satellite and offered my uncle a ride. The man looked normal and seemed friendly, light-hearted even. So my uncle got in the car and they started driving towards Lakeshore Drive. However, once they got there, the man drove south on Lakeshore instead of north, towards Lincoln Park. My uncle told the man he was going the wrong way and to turn around and head north. The man looked at my uncle, put his hand on his knee and said, "No son, you're coming with me," and smiled darkly at him. My uncle froze in panic, and when they hit traffic near the South Shore, he quickly unlocked the passenger door and ran away without looking back. A year or two later, on a cold December day, my uncle was having coffee in a cafe with my future aunt, and he caught something on the TV that made his blood run cold. He saw the man that had picked him up from school that day the year before. He had been arrested for the suspect rape and killing of over 20 young men and boys. The man on the television was John Wayne Gacy, and he had removed the door handle of the passenger side door to prevent the men he picked up from escaping. My family and I used to go camping a lot when I was younger. Camping consisted of renting a cabin in the woods and spending a little time in the wilderness. So we consistently rented this cabin in Pennsylvania where we would spend long weekends, when everyone in the family had some time off. My two brothers and I, each being in the 9 to 12-year-old range, would always run off into the woods and bullshit about while my parents did whatever. The cabin was on the mountain. If you followed a dirt road away past the cabin, the forest would open up there and there was a large field on the top. The field was about the size of a football field. Near the edge of the field, on the far side, was a graveyard. The graveyard was pretty small, about 20 graves, surrounded by wrought iron fence. The fence was about 10 to 12 feet tall, with the Gothic-ish spikes on top. The fence had a gate, but it was locked with a thick, rusty chain and padlock. Being kids, we were able to spread the gates apart enough to squeeze through. The small gravestones were very old and worn. I remember seeing one dated 1890 or something. On top of one of the graves, just resting on it, was a smooth black stone. It looked like onyx or something. A little smaller than a golf ball, but not perfectly round. My older brother pocketed it. We dicked about for a while, then left. Back at the cabin, we had one bedroom, where my parents stayed, and a large living room/kitchen, where we stayed. We were hanging out while my parents were sleeping in bed. It was probably 11:30 or so that night, when a loud happened at the front door, which is right in the living room. Me and my brothers were all scared shitless, understandably too afraid to answer the door. Again, the door shook moments later. It sounded like someone was trying to knock it off the hinges. My father emerged from the bedroom asking what the fuck was going on. The door clashed. He knew by the looks on our faces we had no idea. He grabbed a wood chopping axe we had and walked over to the door. He looked scared shitless himself. He swung the door open and there was nothing but the night. No one in sight. After hounding us for information, and us having no idea, we went back to bed. I think no one slept much, if at all, that night. The next day we were back to digging around in the woods, and we again found ourselves in the old graveyard. The smooth black stone that my brother took was on top of the same grave. We ran fast. My 4-year-old daughter was supposedly asleep when I heard noises coming from her upstairs bedroom. I tried to listen, but I could not make out what was being said. I approached the room, and she stopped talking. Thinking I alarmed her, I went into the room. At the time, she was sharing it with her 3-year-old sister. I walked in and saw the 4-year-old sitting up in bed. I smiled and said, "Is everything okay?" She said fine, but her sister said they were keeping her up. I asked who. My 4-year-old said sorry, but that she was talking. When I asked who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and said, "The girl in the window. She said you were coming." After I shit a brick. I asked who the girl was, and they both said a girl comes and stands in front of the window at night and talks to them. Not knowing what to say, I said okay, tucked them in and hung around outside the door. The next day I asked about the girl. They said she came back but was mad. I waited a few days and asked again. My 4-year-old said the girl in the window was still mad. I forgot about it for about a week. When my wife said, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" Freaked out, I ran up and both girls were sitting under the window looking up. They turned and looked at me and asked if I wanted to meet the girl. When they turned round, disappointed, they said the girl left. It has been about 5 years since, and I've not heard about the girl in the window since then. A few years ago, in 2008, a native friend and I went up to the Northwest Territories on a hunting trip. A little background. I live in Alberta and I'm in the Canadian Army, 3rd Canadian Division, so I'm a good tracker. My friend, who we will call Pano, is also a good tracker. He also lives in Alberta, but was born on a reservation. His family had taught him all the legends and customs when he was growing up, but he handles modern society well, anyway. We drove for a long time. I wasn't keeping track, but it was more than just a few days. We were headed to a heavily forested region west of the Great Slave Lake. There were no government roads back there, so the drive was rough. The snow was also shit, but we were both used to it and loved cold weather anyway. When we had found a good spot to park, we got our things out of the bed of my truck and began our trudging through the snow to find a place to set up camp. We wanted to camp in a place a few kilometres where we parked, to give us a bit of a challenge. Even though it was very heavy snow, the place was beautiful. The nature was completely untouched. I had tried snapping a few shots with my phone, but none of the pictures came out good. It was disappointing, but at least the drive was worth it. After walking for about 3 hours, we came into a clearing in the trees and made the decision that it was where we would set up camp. I began setting up our 2-person tent, and Pano was clearing the snow off the ground to prepare a fire pit. I had set up the tent and our sleeping bags and helped Pano with the fire pit. Once that was done, I told him to follow me to find some firewood. He nodded, understanding that it was going to be dark soon and we would need a fire. We both had hatchets with us and began chopping branches off some of the pine trees close to camp. The wood was wet, so it was going to be difficult to get it dry for the campfire. We had a good stack of thick branches and carried them back. When we returned, there were tracks in the snow that weren't ours. They seemed to be a kind of morphed human footprint. Pano and I exchanged strange looks and set our wood piles in the area that was clear for a fire. "You think someone else is camping nearby?" I asked. Pano shrugged and replied, "I can't say for sure. A normal person wouldn't walk in the snow barefoot." We returned to our tent and took our rifles out of their cases, now alert. "We should get the fire going now. We've probably got an hour left of sunlight," I said. I headed to the pit, set up some of the wood, covered it with some of the dry hay that I had brought for fire starting, and got to work on the flint. The fire died out early, so we tossed our beers in a plastic bag and headed to the tent. I got in my sleeping bag and fell asleep quickly. I was awoken late at night by the sound of snow crunching. I got out of my sleeping bag as silently as I could, but the movement seemed to alert whatever was outside, and the snow crunching stopped. I shook Pano until he woke up. He knew I wouldn't have woken him up unless something was serious. I pointed to the tent door and grabbed my rifle. Pano grabbed his as well. I practically tore the zipper down and snapped my rifle up as fast as I could, stepping out of the tent slowly. Pano held a flashlight in one hand and his rifle in the other, pointing the light in all directions. Nothing, except more footprints like we had found earlier. Something was definitely following us. "I'll get a fire going. Don't you let go of that rifle," I told him. Pano nodded and held his rifle with both hands. I got a fire going as fast as I could and pulled my rifle from around my arm and sat close to the fire. We sat there until sunrise, feeling watched the entire time. I was sweating even though it was probably 5 degrees out. When it was light enough, we made a quick breakfast and decided we would track whatever was following us. For the next 4 hours, we were following a very faint trail. We couldn't be sure what we were following was what made the tracks at camp, or just wildlife. Regardless, we were led to a carcass forced into a branch of a tree. Basically, it was as if someone had torn a caribou in half and forced the second half onto a branch. It smelled awful, and it was partially frozen. It seemed like it had been there for the last day or two. We continued following the trail, but the smell of death and decay never left. Somewhere along the walk, we had heard a very distant, but also very distinct shriek of some sort, like the sound a pig makes when it's being butchered while it's still alive. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. "We should turn and leave," Pano stated. "Why?" "Bad spirits walking among us." I gave him a kind of "what the fuck are you talking about" look, and replied, "Are you sure?" I'd like to know what the hell is out there. Your curiosity is going to get us killed. I sighed and nodded, letting Pano take the point on the walk back. I didn't recognise anything on the way back, not even the dead caribou on the tree. Are we lost? I asked. Pano stopped and turned to me and said, I don't know. The trail vanished only minutes after we turned back. I was pissed. Why the fuck didn't you say anything? I didn't want to alarm you. I figured if we walked in the same direction we came, we would get to camp. Even our own tracks are gone. We need to stop now and figure out where the hell we are. I took my backpack off and opened it up, searching for my map and compass. While I was busy in my backpack, I saw Pano scramble for his rifle from the corner of my eye. He brought it up and fired off 3 rounds. I looked at him and said, What happened? I also brought up my rifle, but noticing Pano's face was white as the snow on the ground. Wendigo, he said. What? Pano didn't reply. He simply began backing up and beckoned to me. I closed my backpack, put it on, and we both jogged through the trees. We had now been out there for close to 7 hours, and the sun was going to set soon. I took duct tape from my bag and secured a flashlight on the end of my rifle, handing the tape to Pano for him to do the same. We were no longer jogging, but picking up the pace indeed. We wouldn't be able to track anything in the dark. We were feeling watched all the time and kept hearing branches snapping only meters away. Somehow though, we found our camp. By this time, it was already dark. We packed up our things as quickly as we could and left the non-essentials behind. Our tent had been torn open as well as our bags. It was very obvious that something was here, right as we were about to depart. I shined my flashlight at the tree line that we had just come out of. What I saw made my animalistic instincts kick into hyperdrive. It looked so skinny that its bones were almost pushing out of its skin. The eyes appeared so sunken, almost black, and the bony fingers were jagged like twigs. It was just standing there, watching us, a vicious black fluid dripping from its mouth. I gasped for air and fired a round, cocked the rifle, fired again and again. My hands were shaking bad. Pano now had also begun firing. Once the smoke had settled, the thing was gone. We were now sprinting to find my truck. I wish we hadn't parked so far away. We had no idea what our surroundings were, only what direction we were going. Everything was dark except for the straying beams of our flashlights. I was so exhausted, and I was now running entirely off of adrenaline. We heard the screams again, but this time it didn't stop and were much closer to us. I turned while running. Where the fuck was Pano? I stopped running, knowing the danger, but I was not going to leave my friend behind. I shouted his name multiple times, only hearing the ghastly, inhuman screeches in return. I shined my flashlight at the trees, desperately looking for any sign of him. He was gone. Then I saw movement. A lot of movement. This was no longer just one thing hunting me. This was many things hunting me. I didn't want to leave Pano behind, but my brain screamed at me to fucking run. Whatever they were now only 1 to 3 meters from me, and my body just kind of turned and began sprinting on its own. At least that's what it felt like. I now knew what it was like to be the gazelle being chased by the lion. I felt nothing but fear. I have no idea how long I was running, but at one point I broke out of the trees and onto the road. I was ecstatic. I continued sprinting down the road until I spotted my truck. I tore my keys from my lanyard and my backpack, and as soon as I got to the door, I shoved the keys in and threw myself into the seat. I locked the door hoping it might do some good, and started the engine. The headlights went on, and there he was, standing in front of the car, Pano. I screamed, "Get in the car!" Instead of running to the passenger door, he twitched and seemed to float towards the driver's door. My instincts once again kicked in, and I slammed the pedal. I was practically flying down the iciest roads you could imagine. I have no idea how I didn't wreck and die. I didn't slow down until I was back on the government road. I was almost crying the entire time. About 2 years ago, I had a roommate who told me this story. She used to work at a hotel in her hometown, a smaller city somewhat more north. A lot of the girls she worked with were in high school as well, and a few of them were kind of slutty. One weekend, one of her promiscuous co-workers, let's call her Lindsay, gave a blowjob to some guy at a house party. A day or two afterward, while at work, Lindsay noticed she had a rash developing around her mouth. She shrugged it off, hoping it would go away, but after a couple of days the rash got much worse. Much worse. She finally decided to go to the doctor. The doctor had no idea what it was just by looking at it, but took a couple of samples and told her he would call her back once the test results came in. Later on the same day, the doctor called Lindsay and said, "We need you to come back to the hospital right now." When Lindsay got back to the doctor, he said to her, "You've got to tell me what you've been doing, because what you have around your mouth is contracted from dead people." It turned out the family of the guy she gave head to owns a funeral home business, and the guy had been fucking corpses. The funeral home has since been shut down. True story.